Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you here. Just give us a couple of minutes so people can come into the webinar. Hope you're all doing well on this fine evening. At least we've had the weather today. It's been quite glorious, albeit a bit cold and a bit windy. So I hope you've been making the most of your sort of countryside and going for your daily exercise, as we're all allowed to do right now. So yeah, we have about 40 people joining us today, which is fantastic. Some very keen people to hear about hedgerows. Just before we begin, for those of you who are new to our sort of online events, my name is Sophie Code. I'm the event manager at Surrey Wildlife Trust. I have my co-host, Sue O'Regan, who's waving at the camera, and obviously Katy, who'll be doing the presentation tonight. I will be handing over to Sue and other of my colleagues for the next few weeks to undertake the talks, as I will be looking after small child and homeschooling. So wish me luck. I wish I was with you all rather than homeschooling, but that is life at the moment. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. You can find this at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions of Katy at any point in the presentation. My colleague Sue will be dealing with the questions, and sort of I will be reading them out afterwards. So do keep your questions coming in. And we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Chat is disabled for everyone to chat amongst themselves, just because I personally find it a little bit distracting. I'm sorry, I'm being a control freak there. But you can chat with any of the panelists. So if you have a technical issue, please don't hesitate to just stick a message in chat, or let me know if there are any issues. We will be recording this webinar tonight, and this will be made available online on our online talks page for a later date. And now I'm going to hand over to the lovely Katy. Thank you, Katy.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So there we go. First issue already. I'll stop clicking my way through things. So thank you so much for all coming to hear a little bit about hedgerows this evening. It's really great that so many people are interested in hearing about them. And so I suppose you're all very interested in what we will be talking about tonight. Well, I'm going to start with telling you a little bit about Hedgerow Heritage, which is a new and exciting project with Surrey Wildlife Trust. I'll tell you why we're doing it, why hedgerows are so fantastic, and sort of the benefits that you can get from hedgerows and those that benefit. Hopefully we won't get any technical glitches. I do have a dog in here with me who hopefully is sleepy enough for walks today, but may come and want to make an appearance at some point. So apologies if you do hear her at any point. So starting with Hedgerow Heritage. So this is a Heritage Lottery funded project. So thank you so much to the lottery for this. The project wouldn't be possible without them. And it is so exciting and great to see hedgerows getting the recognition that they deserve. We're now in the delivery phase of the project. Not that we've done much delivering with the last year of COVID, but hopefully we're looking at a bit of a brighter future with all of that. And hopefully we'll be able to get that rolled out. It is a 4-year project. We've lost 1 year because of COVID, but we're excited to see what we can do in the following 3 years. So where is this project taking place, I hear you ask, because Surrey is a reasonably large place. Well, the project is taking place in an area of the North Downs, which is denoted on the map there by the blue boundary. And we're working with 5 really fantastic project partners. And these include West Horsley Place, Clandon Wood Natural Burial Ground, Sons Place Farm, the National Trust, and Guildford Borough Council. And you can see those on the map in the pink colours. Those are all our fantastic project partners. And then the blue colour denotes the land that Surrey Wildlife Trust is either managing or involved with as well. So hopefully with this project, we're looking to link up more habitat and get more hedgerows in there. So aims of this project, obviously to get more hedgerows in the North Downs, but also to get them in better condition. There's not enough understanding around what is needed for a hedge to really prosper and for wildlife to really benefit from it. So not only do we need more hedges, we really need them to be in better condition to benefit wildlife like this little guy. But a huge part as well of the project, as well as all of that practical land management side of things, is also about local communities, local people, and engaging them with their natural heritage, like re-educating and reintroducing them to all of that fantastic history and wildlife that's right on their doorstep, and get them out and about. And also
Katy, my lovely, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We seem to not be able to see the presentation, darling.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Don't worry.
I wonder why that happened.
Perfect.
Oh, how strange.
See it now. Thank you so much. Sorry for interruption. And
no, please don't worry.
Going with us, everyone. I will now disappear. Thank you, Katy.
No problem. Sorry about that, guys. So I'll just start you there. So where we were, Heavenly Hedgerows, Hedgerow Heritage, why we're looking to get more hedgerows in the North Downs, lottery funded project, and hopefully now you can see this map, which should show you all of the area that we're working in, the blue line with the North Downs, the pink areas of the project sites, and the blue areas that Surrey Wildlife Trust land. So really sorry that you couldn't see that before. And you gotta love it, don't you? It always goes right on the night. It told me I was sharing my screen, so oh well, stranger things have happened. Hopefully you're all caught up now. Aims of the project is to get more hedgerows into the North Downs in better conditions, engage local communities with their natural heritage, but also to create that generation of younger hedgerows so that we can take these heritage skills, that knowledge of the wildlife, into the future. So what do these aims and targets for this project look like practically on the ground? Well, we're aiming to get 6.5 kilometres of hedgerow either planted or laid over the next few years. And that's new hedgerows, so new planting and hedgerows that haven't been laid in the past. And all of this is going to be carried out on our partnership sites. It's all mapped out and ready to go. We know where we want them to be. Everybody's agreed. So it would be simple, right? And then COVID hits, but oh well. Another major point for this project is to get 63 kilometres into management plans. Now, this isn't linked to that 6.5 kilometres that's already planted or laid. It's new areas. So none of this is identified yet. It could be on those partnership sites. It could be on Surrey Wildlife Trust land. But what we're really looking to do as well is engage with new people and looking at where we can work with new people within the North Downs. That's basically the limiting factor for us, is that we want them to be in the North Downs. How are we going to identify this? We're going to look at surveying and working with all of those local communities. So a huge part of what I'm going to be doing in the spring and summer is going out and recruiting and training up an army of volunteers to go out into the North Downs and start building up that data about what the state of those hedgerows are like and where we might be able to have new ones. Now, this is a surveying trip pre-COVID, I should state, and actually for a bird survey. Another huge part of the hedgerow heritage is the Hedgucation side of things. So I'll be looking to develop a Hedgucation pack and engaging with 5 secondary schools to help develop that pack to make it really useful to schools and young people. And with this, I'll be running a lot of events and activities, and also developing an OCN accredited hedge laying course so that it can help people develop their conservation careers and young people get into the sector and build that knowledge around hedgerows. As well as all of that, we'll also be looking to educate local authorities and land managers about how to manage their hedgerows better and where might be good places to have hedgerows on their land. well as all of that, we're also looking to do lots of events. I keep my fingers crossed that we will be able to run a Hedgerow festival. Hopefully, this was supposed to be in 2021, so should be planning it now. We've looked to push that back because we're going to have such a big and fantastic event. We want it to have the biggest impact possible. So we're looking at hopefully 2023 now, as well as also 3 hedge laying competitions, 15 bio blitzes and Hedgucation events, as well as guided walks, an innovative Hedgerow Tales program to get people talking about hedgerows and bring out those stories from the past, and even an exhibition at Dorking Museum. Well, and then there's COVID, the infectious elephant in the room. Obviously, we have had setbacks. We have lost a whole year so far. There's been furlough, delays to plans, working from home to contend with, and even in the summer when restrictions were reduced a bit, we had limits on numbers. So it's really, as we go forward, we're going to have to look at doing things differently. We are going to be living with these restrictions for a while, and we've just got to work with them and really look at how we deliver this project, but in a different way. What does engagement look like? What does participation look like? It doesn't necessarily have to be in the physical, and we can still get that message out there about hedgerows and go forward. And dare I say it, even try and be a little bit innovative. So where we were this winter, I really thought about taking these slides out, but I decided I really wanted to paint the picture of where we've got to, where we've been with the project, and how we're going forward. So we did have 7 weekends at the Chantries in Guildford planned to do hedge laying, as well as a monthly session at Clandon Wood Natural Burial Ground, and 3 weekly sessions at Titings Farm with a pupil referral unit. And unfortunately, all of it was cancelled for now. However, the foundations are set, we are ready to go, and hopefully we'll be able to utilise all of that work next winter when restrictions will hopefully be a lot less. It's the same story with the planting. We had several corporate days planned, and we're looking to get maybe a couple of kilometres planted this year. We had regular weekday planting. We were going to be working with uniform groups like guides and scouts, and sadly it's all been cancelled. But like I say, the foundations are there, the hedgerow house is ready to be built, and we'll hit the ground running, hopefully this winter coming. So what have we been able to do? Well, we've been looking at going virtual like all organisations, and so we've had the time to really develop our website, the innovative Hedgerow Tales programme, which I'm slightly terrified to take to an online version, but we're going to give it a go. We'll see how it goes. We're looking at developing a hedgerow animation as well that we can take into schools and put on social media pages to get the message about why hedgerows are so valuable out there. And we've also really been able to utilise working with schools. During the second lockdown in November, schools were open, and we were really able to utilise that and able to do some Green Day events and some audits of school grounds with schools and start to get that message about hedgerows and build those relationships there as well. So we really have tried to take advantage where we can. Also looking at doing some webinars and also our social media content. But we're all very excited about the bright and shiny prospects of 2021 and what we'll hopefully be able to get out there doing, which is people out on the ground, learning these new skills, engaging with the heritage, and really making a mark on the North Downs. So this spring and summer, we're really looking to start that surveying effort, really start to build that picture of the North Downs, start to have a few events with restrictions allowing, continue to work with schools, and really finish utilising and getting to run with those virtual events as well. So why are we doing all of this, I hear you cry? Well, for lack of a better phrase, hedgerows are great. They really are amazing, and they provide homes and safe passage and food, navigation and tools and shelter to wildlife. They protect populations of wildlife in our countryside from becoming isolated and therefore much more vulnerable and risking local extinction. Hedgerows help to fill niches where other habitat types are lacking, and they provide numerous ecosystem services, to name but a few things. I'll be telling you a lot about all of these amazing functions, how they do it, and highlight some of the amazing species associated with our hedgerows. But first, I didn't feel like we could do a real hedgerow presentation without getting into a little bit of the history of hedgerows. So first of all, I'll just give you a brief overview of the hedgerow. I'm a little bit of a history nerd, so I think it's quite interesting, and it helps to build that picture of the hedgerows. So hedgerows were first used by early farmers to separate livestock from the crops. The first mention of a hedge being planted is in 940 AD by the somewhat still famous monk Elfric. So he could be the first of our hedgerow heroes, and we're still developing today. Looking at the orientation of the word hedgerow, there's a few different meanings and originations that come out of it. First being haga, which comes from the Old English word meaning an enclosure, and itself derived from the Saxon word for hawthorn fruit. And then my favorite is hege. I'm probably not pronouncing these right at all. I'm probably making a real butchers of it, but hege, I think, is a really nice one, which is another Saxon word meaning living boundary rather than a mere fence, which I think is a really nice way to sum up the hedgerow. So it's sometimes suggested that hedges are quite recent artifacts created in the 18th and 19th century, which apparently is relatively recent to some people. And this was in response to the Parliamentary Enclosures Act, and so are of little historical value. Well, this is true for some counties, it's just not the case for a lot of others either. So in some others, most hedges are considered a lot older. So for example, in Devon, a quarter of the hedges are reckoned to be over 800 years old. And the Enclosures Act actually had little impact on the countryside because it was already so heavily hedged. And indeed, in Dartmoor, some hedges can clearly be identified as part of the reeve system, which are long track lines that extend over hill and vale of Dartmoor, indicating tribal boundaries back in the Bronze Age, some 3,500 years ago. So hedgerows really do provide some of the only records we sometimes have of man's use of the countryside over hundreds of years. They really are a living part of our natural history. I often walk past trees, having now become obviously very interested and have a love of hedgerows. And I walk past bits and I think, ancient hedgerow, much like the picture here. And as soon as you start looking and you start picking up on it, you see evidence everywhere of ancient boundaries, whether it's a tree like this one that was long ago coppiced, a line of ancient oaks on a boundary or on a raised bank. Other trees are available. You also get other ancient species as well, but there's nothing like and nothing quite as imposing as a real ancient oak, and especially a long line of them. Or even a tree that was clearly attempted to be laid and is now growing in one long bit with lots of other shoots coming up. And you wonder what their history is. And yeah, they just, once you start looking for them, it's really hard to miss them, especially when they're as big as like these ones. So not only are they fantastic in denoting history in our landscape, many are archaeological sites in their own right. They contain artifacts, plant fossils, they preserve pollen and much more beneath their bases. So, oh, there we go. Looking at the importance of hedgerows, they really are recognised as one of our most important habitats, and people are really starting to value, especially nature conservationists. Increasingly, it's being recognised as one of our most important wildlife habitats. Flowers blossom and bees buzz and hedgerow snuffle and the berries are fed on and so on and so on and so many more. They give grain and texture to the countryside and are of real nature conservation, historic and landscape value. They're critical wildlife reserves, and hedgerow length has even been associated with small mammal biomass. A wealth of field studies have shown that linear features contribute greater biodiversity to the farmland environment. We've also found that despite there being strong evidence for these linear features and how important they are, that there is a severe lack of data, even though so many species rely on them. I will come back to that later on, and obviously it's a big part of what we're trying to do with hedgerow heritage. it's also been identified that up to 130 priority biodiversity action plan species are associated with hedgerows. And this includes the trees that you find in hedgerows, but also the banks and the flora, as well as the immediate margins. People so often forget about the margins adjacent to the hedgerows, but all of this weaves together to make hedgerows what they are. While there are a few species which are dependent on hedgerows alone, the loss of hedgerows or a decline in their quality would likely have an adverse effect on lots of this wildlife. So I keep mentioning a lot of this wildlife, and I thought it would be nice to just actually look at some of those iconic species. And it would be impossible to do a presentation without talking about the Hazel dormouse, as it is one of our most iconic and yet threatened hedgerow species. So hedgerows really are key for dormice because they're used as dispersal corridors, as an important link between small copses that are too small to support a viable population of dormice on their own. And what we mean by this is perhaps a dormouse or a dormouse family is nesting in a hazel copse, so an area that's full of hazel trees. This is just one food source, and hazelnuts are only available at one time in the year. And so it's not going to be enough on its own for dormice, so they have to roam further. But they're very much what we call an arboreal species. They don't really like to be down on the ground. They prefer to be up in the treetops or certainly hidden away in foliage. So without those dispersal corridors with features like hedgerows, these populations can become very isolated and therefore vulnerable on their own. And the huge loss of hedges has led to isolated populations and even local extinctions, we think, because even a small gap in a hedgerow could be too much for a dormouse to overcome and an obstacle to its dispersal. Crucially, though, not only are they used as these dispersal corridors, they are also supporting breeding populations in their own right. So a hedgerow can support breeding populations of dormice completely independently of other habitats. Research carried out by the Royal Holloway University of London has shown that hedgerows support as high a number of dormice as woodland, so really are that critical. So the removal of hedgerows and their declining management and how well they're doing will have reduced dormouse populations nationally, it would seem. So you think, wow, dormice are able to live exclusively in hedgerows. For me, I was quite overwhelmed by that. You think, well, how? Like, surely dormice need more than that. But actually, when you look at what their food sources are, hedgerows have everything that dormice need. So they really do play an important role for the dormice. So just to give you a bit of a picture, dormice emerge in the spring from their hibernation. They are notoriously one of the laziest mammals and awake for some of the smallest amount of time during the year. But they emerge in the spring. Following months, they've generally spent their time up sleeping, and then they'll spend their time in the ground once they're up and in the trees and shrubs. And in April, they like to feed on these two plants. So on the left there, we've got blackthorn, and on the right, hawthorn. At this point, what I want to do is ask you if you know how to tell the difference between blackthorn and hawthorn. But obviously, with the wonderful world that we're living in with virtual webinars, I can't really do that. But blackthorn on the left there, that flowers in the spring before it buds. So you'll see these bare branches with beautiful blossom on and not a leaf in sight. You know that that's blackthorn in a hedge. Whereas on the right, you have the hawthorn, which flowers after the tree has budded. So now if you're walking past a hedgerow and you see the black branches with just the flowers, you'll know it's blackthorn. Whereas on the right, if you see the green buds and the flowers, you'll know it's hawthorn. But anyway, dormice. So they emerge in the spring and they're feeding on the flowers of the blackthorn and the hawthorn going forward. And this is to help replace some of their body fats and what they've lost during hibernation. In early summer, they move on to ash keys and also honeysuckle flowers, and even insects such as aphids, which is what they rely on later in the year. Going forward, as they're looking into autumn time, they're looking to put on those fat reserves back on again, looking to go into hibernation for the winter. And we haven't even really talked about the energy that's required for breeding. But anyway, building up those fat reserves, they're looking at blackberries, and also, of course, the classic hazelnut to provide food source to build up all of that fat for the winter. And so, as you can see, that's such a diversity of foods and plant resources, and really, dormouse to me seems a little bit high maintenance with all of those requirements. But hey, they're pretty cute, so I suppose they get away with it. So moving on to another species that really heavily relies on hedgerows are bats. And I think it's really interesting to go for such an arboreal, like ground mammal species that we associate, which we can kind of understand with needing those hedgerows, because they're a small mammal, they don't want to be exposed, they like to stay in the trees. Whereas bats really are very reliant on hedgerows and linear features, which maybe doesn't seem quite as natural because they're flying around, but it just shows the depth and breadth of the need for hedgerows from our native wildlife. So linear features in our landscape, such as hedgerows, are just so important for bats. Hedgerows, woodland edge, and ditches is what I mean by those linear features, can all form commuting routes between roosting sites and feeding areas. And these features can aid navigation and even provide shelter from the wind during flight. And hedgerow trees might even form a little roosting opportunity for bats throughout the year. If they just can't quite be bothered to get back one evening, back to the main roost, they can hole up in a tree just for a night and keep going the next day. And a network of well-connected hedgerows and other linear features within a landscape allows many species of bat to extend their foraging and their roosting capacity through the landscape. And again, even though they're a flying species, their range can be constricted if these features aren't in the landscapes that they're living in. So hedgerows also obviously provide a fantastic food source for bats, easy for me to say, through all of the invertebrates they can hold, because hedgerows are also such a vital habitat for invertebrates for their courtship and breeding and feeding, and hence then provide a great foraging opportunity and resource for bats. I thought it would be nice just to zone in on a particular species of bat as well. And I'm going to have a little look at the greater horseshoe bat. So as most of us know, bats navigate and find their way through echolocation, which most of us have heard of. And this is where the bat calls out at a very high frequency and listens for the return echo. And so they can it bounces off objects and they can build up a picture of the landscape around them. And this also, not only do they build up that picture of the landscape, it obviously helps them hunt down food and feed. So they're building up a fantastic picture through the echolocation, but it's also how they hunt as well. However, with the greater horseshoe bat, their echolocation disappears very readily out into the night, which means they need to stay close to hedges and other linear features, otherwise they can get lost and disorientated, making hedges even more important for the greater horseshoe bat. And they rely very heavily on those landscape features, as well as waterways to navigate through the countryside. Without hedges, bats would struggle to find their way in the dark. But as well as this, they also provide habitat and shelter for the insects, like I said before. And the greater horseshoe bat feeds exclusively on those insects. So it's just another way in which hedgerows really are essential for this species. And almost all hunting for a greater horseshoe bat occurs within 10 meters of a hedge. Another way that they hunt is that some species of bat, and this includes the greater horseshoe bat, lesser horseshoe bat, also brown long-eared and natterer's bat, take insects directly from the foliage, and this is known as gleaning, which I think if you were an insect might be a pretty awful way to go, but it might be pretty quick. So obviously this method of hunting is also another reason why it's keeping them really close to those hedges. Unfortunately, the greater horseshoe bat is locally extinct in Surrey, which is obviously a great shame. But with better news, a small colony of greater horseshoe bats has recently been discovered breeding in West Sussex. So it's the first sign of residency, perhaps even recovery, since the Great Decline, when all of the southeast home counties lost the species as a resident. in the early half of the 20th century. So we've really got to get all of our hedgerows in tip-top condition when they eventually make their way back to us. So I couldn't really do a presentation about hedgerows and talk about all of the iconic species that rely on and can be found within a hedgerow without talking about the hedgehog. Although interestingly, this is a picture I took of a hedgehog in a city hugging a wall on a pavement in the middle of a city in Croatia. So maybe our European hedgehogs on the continent do it slightly differently, or perhaps it was just making its way between two urban gardens, or was just having a terrible evening and completely disorientated. Either way, it was a lovely sight for me to see on holiday in Croatia when we were still allowed to do things like that. When we'll be able to do it again, hopefully soon. Anyway, I digress. The hedgehog is one of the most familiar British mammals. Obviously, we've all heard of hedgerows, even though they are sadly in decline. It is a solitary, nocturnal or ground-dwelling animal that eats a variety of invertebrates such as earthworms and slugs, beetles, caterpillars, snails, but also, interestingly enough, they do like carrion and chicks if they can get their teeth on them, I suppose. So they really are a proper little hog and will eat whatever they can come across, really. And hedgehogs mainly inhabit those woodland edge and those general edge habitats. So woodland edge, rough grassland, and that hedge habitat as well. And a good hedge for hedgehogs is one that has a thick base, a wide field margin accompanying it, and linking habitat in the landscape. So once again, they need it to be joined up and so they can get around. Hedgehogs really make use of those thick bases in a hedge with tussocky vegetation and plenty of twiggy material and leaves. And this will create suitable habitat for daytime shelter when they're snoozing and hiding from us all, and also winter hibernation sites. And they do like to build their nests under the dense low cover of bramble. So although bramble's always getting a bit of a bad rep, we've already heard about how important it is for a couple of species. And a hedge that has no gaps and is connected with other areas and patches of scrub and woodland or rough grassland is what hedgehogs need, so they can move freely through the landscape without having to go into the wider areas. There's a lot of evidence that points to hedgerows being less abundant in areas where the landscape matrix contains fewer hedgerows and larger fields. And research has shown that hedgehogs rarely venture out into arable fields, so they really need that dense cover. But if they've got it and they've got a good linked up habitat, they can range between 2 to 4 kilometers hunting for food in an evening. So that is quite wide ranging for such one of our quite small little mammals. Moving on to birds, obviously I'd say it's probably one of the species we're seeing most out and about and in our hedgerows, whether that's in our gardens or out in the countryside or on farmland. And many of our British bird species are associated with hedgerows. And woodland birds such as blue tits and great tits, wrens, blackbirds, robins, and chaffinches are all common species to see within a bird, and even marsh tits, which are just pictured in the picture here. But they're more associated with the taller, wider hedges. Again, kind of that woodland edge habitat. And a taller hedge provides more habitat, obviously, there's more of it, and is therefore more likely to provide space for a larger number of breeding territories within that hedge, which is a good thing to have in it. But there's other bird species as well. Even those that prefer the scrubby or open woodland species can also be associated with hedge, which is dunnocks, which we often see in our gardens, known as the hedge sparrows, but also yellowhammer and whitethroat also use hedgerows a lot. And hedge plants provide not just breeding and hiding and nesting spots, but also song posts and perches for territorial and breeding birds. So lots of different ways that birds are using those hedges. Not only that, the nests that they make in those hedgerows, and once they leave them and they start to age and decay, may support vast populations of invertebrates. And hedgerow bases, to name another niche within the hedgerows, are also important for ground nesting birds such as the grey partridge. I don't know if you can tell, but the dog is trying really hard to distract me at this point. She's clearly already not feeling like the centre of attention. But we will move on to invertebrates. So honestly, the number of invertebrates that are using, benefiting and filling the niches within a hedgerow goes on and on. You could do an entire webinar on invertebrates in hedgerows, and I'm sure there are species that we haven't even discovered yet that are in those hedgerows, whether that's tiny little solitary wasps, where they reckon there could be hundreds that we haven't even discovered yet. But I will do my best just to mention a few of those fantastic invertebrate species that are so vital for our countryside. So hedgerows generally supply food, shelter, and breeding sites for pollinators and other invertebrates, such as bees, as well as solitary bees and also solitary wasps, but also those more predatory invertebrates like the scorpion fly as well. Bumblebees are known to use hedgerows to guide their foraging activity, and stag beetles can even sometimes be found around the decaying wooden material at the base. Moving on to butterflies, more than 20 of the butterfly species found in lowland Britain breed in hedgerows, including the brown hair streak butterfly, which is a priority BAP species, and I'll talk a little bit more about that one a bit later in the presentation. But it lays its eggs in blackthorn and is really vital to that species particularly. The holly blue butterfly also can be found in hedgerows, especially the caterpillar. But you won't find holly blues in there unless it's full of ivy or also holly. Makes sense with the name, right? Also, brimstones prefer blackthorn and alder buckthorn, and the purple emperor and pearl-bordered fritillary are among the species that use hedgerows for nectar. But this isn't just limited to butterflies. You know, it's all kinds of invertebrates will be using them for nectar, as food plants for their caterpillars or their grub life stages. It really does go on and on. Hedges are also used by some species, not just for breeding or feeding. They will also use them as perches or territorial spots. So such as the peacock butterfly, males will establish perching sites and see off other butterflies which come in. I've seen butterflies even try and see off birds sometimes. So it really is quite an incredible thing. As well as all these butterfly species, incredible numbers of moths as well are associated with hedgerows. And features that affect the butterfly density of hedgerows, but also other and vast numbers of invertebrates, it kind of is a bit of a blanket effect, will include shelter from winds. So you need a denser hedge to protect them from the wind, and insulation, nectar provision. So there's got to be a variety of plants providing nectar at different times, as well as diversity in species, margin area, and uncropped land for optimal butterfly activity, but also general invertebrate activity. Hedges should create a network where shade and shelter are available as long as possible through the year and when weather conditions are changing. So now reptiles, which perhaps isn't one that you would naturally associate with hedgerows, but I thought it was important to highlight reptiles in here because it demonstrates what a valuable habitat it is for such a variety of species and groups of wildlife, especially in the case for dispersal and movement around habitats, especially when we're losing some of our key habitats. You know, it is no secret that there are less wildlife places out there or not in as good condition. And hedgerows really can be a lifeline to any kind of species looking for a bit of protection and to disperse through the ever-changing countryside. So hedgerows provide that valuable corridor and helping them to move around. And not only having the hedgerow, but broad, uncultivated margins will also help reptiles and protect them. And the areas that are protected from grazing animals in a farmland area will also help those reptile species. And like all reptiles, a sunny side of the hedge is also very helpful. So hopefully it's kind of clear from what we've been talking about that hedgerows are not only doing very well in their own right to help our local and native wildlife, but hedgerows are even starting to fill other niches within our countryside. So as demonstrated by the greater horseshoe bat, they prefer hedges that mimic that woodland edge habitat. So have perhaps hedgerow trees in there and are allowed to grow a bit wild and a bit larger and bushier, because they are mimicking that woodland edge habitat. And they're tall enough then to act as shelter and a windbreak, and bushy enough to give good structure and a range of microclimates within them. And in an ideal world, we would have more woodland, more scrubby woodland edges, larger banks, more streams and waterways and grasslands. But sadly, that's not the reality. So hedgerows are able to fill those gaps in some of the areas where our landscape is incomplete. So hopefully now you're thinking, wow, hedgerows can support so much. What a fantastic job they're doing. I'm really glad they're there in our countryside, which is good. That is how we want you to feel. Perhaps you're also thinking like, how? Well, there's so much more to a hedge than purely a line of trees and a diversity of plants. Like, hedgerows are full of structure and species and niches, and different features of a hedgerow will be important and valuable to different species. The more diverse in composition a hedgerow is, the more species it is likely to support due to the diversity of flowering times, as well as fruiting bodies and the different habitats and areas that are within that hedge. Really, the key to a variety and abundance of wildlife, aka biodiversity, is variety itself. The key to hedgerows being able to support such an abundance of wildlife is the variety in the hedge. This looks like a strong and diverse base to that hedge, as well as a very diverse structure in the middle of it, different heights and different age within the hedge, as well as providing. And all of this comes together to help provide those different niches and micro habitats and micro niches that so much different wildlife can fill and exploit. And also it's about the plants within the hedge, and so much more than that. It needs that variety of plants and them well looked after. So what does this look like practically? So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time telling you about the different components within a hedge. Now I'm going to keep that quite broad. You know, it's a Thursday evening. We don't need to get to subatomic components for you. So we're going to keep it to like the top 5 hedgerow components. So those are the standard tree, and then that shrubby hedge layer, the bottom of the hedge, as well as the bank and ditches, and also that hedgerow margin, which I've talked about quite a lot, but often gets forgotten. So starting with hedgerow trees. So it's not necessarily the first thing you might think of when thinking about a hedgerow, but it's so important for such a variety of wildlife. And hedgerow trees especially are really important to that brown hair streak butterfly, which I mentioned before. And this is actually the largest of our native hair streak butterflies, but also one of the most elusive. They spend a lot of time in the tops of trees or otherwise in hedgerows. And if you're lucky enough to see one, it's likely to be a female, and she would be laying her small white little butterfly eggs in the forks or notches of young blackthorn shoots. And they also provide vantage points for different bird species. One of the quintessential features of summer for me is seeing yellowhammers sat in the tops of hedgerows or in a hedgerow tree singing their little hearts out. So again, there's lots of those vantage points for different species, especially birds, and then also, of course, nesting sites and tree sparrows, which are heavily declining, often use those hedgerow trees to breed in. Sadly though, as important as hedgerow trees are, they are in decline. And one study saw a 3.9% drop between 1997 and 2000. Now, that might sound not like a huge amount in a short amount of time, but it's a very worrying trend, and it's continuing to be on the up, and who knows where it's at now. And even more worrying is knowing that over half of the priority BAP species are dependent or partially dependent on those hedgerow trees. They do form such a strong part and what's needed in a hedge. And mature and veteran trees tend to be even more important, and especially as we are losing more and more of our ancient woodlands, those ancient veteran mature trees become even more important. So moving on to that shrubby component of a hedge, which is probably the most typical part of a hedge that people think of. It's that strong middle section, which is bushy and full of leafy parts, and where you might expect to see birds nesting ordinarily. And so that shrubby component is the habitat that's created by those main shrubs that form the bulk of the hedge. And it's what you really do think of when you see that hedge. And the dense cover provided by a well-managed shrubby hedgerow is really important to so much wildlife, as well as helping it to perform those ecosystem services and different functions that I will talk about a little bit later. Sadly, this kind of area with lack of management is also in decline. So that decline in the quality of that shrubby area. And when it declines, it makes the interiors of those hedgerows a lot more open to the elements and can expose those species that are living within the hedge to predators and make them more vulnerable. And they think this link in the lack of quality in that shrubby layer has been linked to the decline of dormouse and a number of farmland birds, including the turtle dove, bullfinch, and beautiful linnet, which is appearing in this picture here. So moving on to another part of the hedgerow is the hedgerow base. So I bet you're already thinking so many different parts to a hedgerow, but a base is another really important part and is really important for up to 41% of those priority hedgerow species. And one group of animals that we haven't talked about yet is amphibians. And this is part of the hedge that can be really important for them, such as great crested newts and common toads utilize this part of the hedge for foraging for invertebrates and other prey along the base of the hedgerows, along with your hedgehogs and various other things that may well take advantage of trying to find a frog or a toad if they can get their hands on it. Basically, having that strong, well-managed base to a hedgerow does help to provide that safe highway to so many of those very ground-based species. And the hedge base can provide a buffer zone and is a really important part of what the hedge base can do. It provides that buffer to protect root systems, which can almost be considered a habitat in its own right and in providing an important service to other trees and plants. So looking at some of other types of species that might utilize that hedge base, the reed bunting nest in or close to the base of hedges, as well as lots of other ground nesting species. Quite often people don't realize how many of our native bird species are ground nesting or very close to the ground nesting birds, which include robins and wrens, as well as many others like our reed bunting. And it just helps. If you've got a good one, you can have a barrier to predators with a good hedge base, which can just benefit so much wildlife. So moving on to the hedgerow margin, which I think is probably the part of the hedge which gets forgotten the most, but is such a valuable tool to the hedgerow, as well as being an asset to the hedgerow. Having that good hedge margin can really help to protect the hedgerow, especially in an agriculture or farmland environment. It can protect it against pesticides, being cut or flailed, and just creates that buffer zone to protect the hedge. So if your field, as much as you really need to protect and manage your field margin independently, if it's not being, it's at least hopefully protecting the hedge from taking a bit of a bashing as well. So not only is it that protection and help to the hedgerow, it really is its own habitat and enhances the hedge habitat in itself as well. And because it's this important and it has all these benefits, it's obviously really important to a lot of species as well. So the hedgerow margin is important for 34% of those priority BAP species. And it does this in a number of ways. It's really important to them because it's providing nectar in the form of different plants and flowering plant species and pollen for invertebrates. And then with those invertebrates that are being fed on by other bird species, as well as the seeds that can be found in those hedgerow margins, and also everything else, so bigger mammals as well. And also it's a home for some wildlife. So species like the harvest mice build their nests in the tall vegetation of the hedgerow bases and margins. And we all love a harvest mouse and want more of those around in our countryside. Another really important thing that we find in hedgerows is deadwood. So it's an incredibly important resource that can be found within the structure of a hedge. And not only is there the deadwood in there, but it's also that plant matter as well. And it can provide a valuable habitat for many invertebrates. Like I say, the amount of niches and different opportunities for invertebrates within a well-managed hedge is infinite, almost, I would say. And in turn, by providing all of this fantastic habitat for invertebrates, which will provide food for predators such as bats, shrews and birds, as well as other small mammals, but also cover for that wildlife. So having those factors and that plant matter is really important. As I mentioned before as well, the hedge base is an important feature and provides that buffer zone for roots, and it's a fantastic habitat in its own right. And that deadwood and that plant matter will only help to enhance that. Often when we are hedge laying, we come across a lot of deadwood and we have to remove it, because to lay the hedge, we have to expose the base. But it's so important that once we're done, we put a lot of it back in and weave it into the hedge laying, because it is that important to have it in there. Diversity, there's that word again, and it really is key to what makes hedgerows great and fantastic and keeps them functioning so well. So the more of these features we have, the more diversity within that hedgerow, it will be important to lots of different species. And many species don't just use one component or one structure within a hedge, they're using lots. So for example, birds are nesting in one section of the hedge, but foraging for food in another and perching on the very top. It needs to be that, we often talk about in conservation, that mosaic of habitats and linking them all together. And this is that on a much smaller scale. It's a mosaic of structure within hedgerows and within that one habitat. And the more diverse in composition a hedgerow is, the more species it is likely to support, due to those variety and different fruiting times and nectar and pollen and everything like that. And to help achieve that, you also need that diversity in plants as well. So your native hedge species are going to promote the most diversity, such as blackthorn, hawthorn, hazel, dogwood, field maple, will all help to support a big breadth of wildlife, as opposed to maybe your non-native garden plants like garden privet, leylandii, and sycamore even. But I feel like most of us know that. We know that we need to promote those native hedge species, as pretty as some of them can look in our gardens. So now, guys, I hope you're enjoying yourselves and you've enjoyed talking about some of those species and those different functions of the hedgerow and the species that are enjoying them. But I really wanted to talk a little bit about ecosystem regulation and ecosystem services and some of those fantastic functions that hedgerows are helping us to provide. Webinars are always a bit of a strange one, I think. We've all done a lot of them over the last few years, but hopefully you're with me, and I find some of those ecosystem services really fascinating and what are really tangible solutions to the climate crisis, which can be almost paralyzing with fear at times, but actually having tangible solutions that we can picture and we can see how can come into play can actually be really helpful. So I wanted to include some of those ecosystem services in here. So just to define it, ecosystem services are the benefits provided by ecosystems that contribute to making human life both possible and worth living. Now that's only one definition, they go a lot deeper, but that gives you a bit of a feel for it. And hedgerows are great at providing those systems. So these range from increasing and protecting water quality. Hedges have been found to be very effective at preventing nutrients and other pollutants from reaching our water bodies, as well as also providing pollination services to farmers. Obviously, you know, increasing the amount of nectar and pollen in their landscape helps those pollinator communities. And there's strong evidence exists that hedges enhance population size and diversity of those pollinators. So really key to our local farmers. So I'm going to talk about a few of those ecosystem services. We're going to cover protection from the wind, water and soil erosion, protecting crops and livestock, as well as providing those nectar and pollen sources, but also how they are filtering out particulate matter in urban centres, perhaps even better than trees are. So just to cover exactly what those ecosystem services are again, they're generally considered to fit into 4 broad types. So you've got your supporting services, and this is nutrient and water cycling, soil formation, and primary production. You get regulating services, so climate control and pollution removal. Provisioning services, so creating food and medicines and building materials, which hedgerows have been doing for, well, hundreds of years in the form of creating all of those woody materials that we used to use, such as making brooms and hurdles and other old crafts that sadly aren't as common anymore, but have still been used a lot throughout history. And then one that often gets forgotten again, sadly, is cultural services. So societal appreciation of nature and the environment. Have we ever had a year where this hasn't been more apparent? Green space and wildlife has never been so recognised, and we've never needed it more than I think the year we've just had. That's just in our most immediate histories, but we've had decades of, I've lost my words, sorry. There's lots of studies is the word I want, looking at how people in hospitals recover quicker with green, if they've got a view of green spaces. So hedgerows are doing us a great cultural service, especially in urban centres as well. So first of all, looking at how hedgerows protect from the wind, water and soil erosions. So hedgerows prevent loss of soil from fields in an agricultural setting, either through reducing that wind erosion or through acting as a physical barrier to waterborne runoff. It makes sense, doesn't it? There is a barrier in the way. It's stopping as much escaping. This is particularly so in arable areas, both where the land is flat and prone to wind blow, such as the fens of East Anglia, and in hilly areas where loss of soil from heavy rain can be a major problem, sweeping it down the hillsides. So hedgerows can really help towards that. Hedgerows also can reduce the amount of polluting fertilizers and pesticides and sediment that reach watercourses through acting as, once again, a physical barrier, but also increasing filtration into the ground and through nutrients being recycled by the trees and shrubs and other plants that are making up that hedgerow and the barriers. So also there is that protection from wind, speed over the ground surface, reducing the water through loss of evaporation. So hedgerows can really regulate water supply in 3 main ways. So firstly, they decrease the wind speed over the ground surface, so reducing that water loss through evaporation in areas prone to drought. Now that doesn't sound maybe like it's doing that much, preventing evaporation because they're decreasing the wind speed, but as we go forward and we are having much more frequent weather events, then we're going to need everything we've got. And if hedgerows can help to reduce that water being lost from the ground in those extreme droughts, then it's definitely worth preserving and valuing. Secondly, hedgerows can help to store water for later use. There was one study that found that a 50-metre hedgerow at the bottom of a 1 hectare field could store up to between 150 and 375 cubic meters of water during a rainy period for slow release during drier times going forward. Now this was found to be most appropriate on clay soils or those with organic matter. Might not work quite as well with sandy soil, but still going to help a bit, I think. And then thirdly, because of their deep roots, hedgerows remove water faster from the soil than crops during periods of excessive rainfall through increased evapotranspiration, which I think makes sense. You've got a well-established hedgerow that's got a number of years behind it. They're going to have a greater root system than regularly planted crops. So then you've got your protection for crops and livestock, which also helps to create that protection for wildlife as well. So it obviously helps to protect them against the elements. You're helping to prevent those wind elements as well as rain during the winter, but then also providing shade and some respite from the heat during the summers. And all of those climatic effects that I've mentioned before will help to protect those crops, draining the land or providing water during those drought periods. And obviously it's just that sense of protection for livestock as well. Often when I'm walking in the countryside, you often see the livestock huddled around the features within the field. And I think it does just help to give them that extra bit of protection. And it's the same for our wildlife as well. So I could talk, I've recently had quite an interest in how hedgerows and green infrastructure can influence our urban centres. So I am going to try and keep it brief on this one, but I can only tell you it's a fascinating subject and we would be here all night, but I'll keep it short. Hedgerows really are valued and becoming more so for the role they play in reducing pollution, especially in urban centres. And even in those centres, they've been found to take out particulate matter from the air and even remove heavy metals. There was a study done by the University of Surrey that showed if you want to control air pollution in urban environments, rather than planting trees, you would be better off planting low-level hedgerows, as these seem to be better at reducing atmospheric pollution. So it always goes back to right tree, right place. And sometimes it needs a bit more than just planting trees. In urban areas, hedgerows contribute to services such as just falling over my words now. I'm going to start again. In urban areas, hedgerows contribute to services such as climate regulation, sustainable urban drainage, reducing those airborne particulates, atmospheric pollution, and providing wildlife habitats. Obviously, we love seeing the house sparrows and robins within our urban centres, in our cities and in our gardens. And they obviously improve the aesthetic appearance of that built up area as well. So that's just a few of those fantastic services that hedgerows and other green infrastructure are providing in our urban centres. And it really is fascinating once you look into it. And I will just say that green infrastructure isn't just a park or a hedge or a tree in an area. It's also permeable pavements and other features. And I think it's going to be something that people are going to have to look into more and more as we do keep having these frequent weather events. I mean, the flooding that we're seeing at the moment is awful, and it feels like we're going to have to do more about it. And perhaps green infrastructure and more hedgerows and better infrastructure in our agricultural areas could really go towards helping this. And not only that, it can even have that effect on our temperatures. And hedgerows and those park areas have been found to have an ameliorating effect on the temperatures of our cities, with parks being up to 7 degrees cooler than the surrounding built up areas. So it's very tangible effects that they can have in these urban areas. So management is key. Now, I'm not going to go into management too much in this webinar because there's actually another webinar next week going into management, because it's so key that it gets its own webinar. And unfortunately, as fantastic as hedgerows are, hedgerows can't achieve any of this without good management. They need that thick, bushy layer, that strong base without gaps, to be able to perform all of those functions. Without it, you get hedgerows like this on the side. You can't just plant a line of trees and think, fantastic, we've got hedgerows. They need love and care. You need to plant it, look after them. After a certain number of years, you need to lay that hedge. And then going forward, you then need to manage them, keep taking the tops off, making sure the bottoms stay nice and bushy. Because if you don't, unfortunately, hedgerows don't look after themselves. And you'll start with this, which can lead to this, which I'm not even sure we can really call that one a hedgerow anymore. It has some hedge-like features, but maybe not quite a hedgerow at this point. And this one certainly is no longer stock proof. I don't think it's quite lived up to its Hege title of being a living boundary anymore. But hey, if you're interested in how to manage those hedgerows and keep them fantastic for wildlife, or even if you're looking to have one in your garden, then it would be lovely if you wanted to join us next week. Hopefully you'll get to see the whole presentation from the word go as well, and we won't have any more issues with Zoom. So corridors and that continuity of habitat with hedgerows. Throughout sharing with you my love of hedgerows and my appreciation of them, I've deliberately tried to focus on how valuable hedgerows are in their own right and the wildlife that thrives in them and the benefits they can provide. But even while trying to focus on that, it's impossible not to talk about that continuity of habitat. And it's overwhelmingly apparent how valuable they are as those corridors and dispersal methods for a variety of species, not least of all those dormice and bats, as well as, you know, invertebrates with low dispersal rates. They are a vital, safe passage for wildlife to move in and around and through our ever-changing and slightly more dangerous landscape. It allows dispersal between habitats, which otherwise might become isolated habitats with isolated species, which then become very vulnerable and can lead to local extinctions. And what is always very clear to me, and forgive me for painting this picture, but they are truly the wild highways that run through our landscape. And without them, wildlife can become as stuck as we do when a road floods or a bridge collapses. However, it doesn't stop there. They aren't just wildlife highways. They're also homes and restaurants and hotels and travel lodges. They are wildlife supermarkets, as well as B&Q and even a John Lewis. And they really do deserve our appreciation. And overall, they need our protection. Which brings me back once again to this lack of data. And there is an overwhelming lack of it. And that is what Hedgerow Heritage is looking to change. And going forward into the spring and summer, I'm really excited about getting all of our surveying efforts and sending our army of PPE'd volunteers out into the North Downs countryside to build up that picture of the state of our hedgerows and how we go forward with that. So if anyone is interested in getting involved with Hedgerow Heritage, please do become a volunteer and show your interest in Hedgerow Heritage. Or if you're already a volunteer, get in touch and let us know that you're interested, and we'll get you signed up to be doing some surveying in the summer. And so there we are, everyone. We've been on our slightly mad journey of hedgerows. Thank you for sticking with me, and sorry for what sounded like my neighbours doing some DIY this evening, the dog coming and demanding to be let out, and not even being able to see the presentation at the start. But thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have really enjoyed hearing about why I love hedgerows and maybe appreciate them a little bit more now. But yeah, that's all from me. And are there any questions?
Katy, thank you so much. I have been absolutely glued to your presentation, grinning like a Cheshire cat. So incredibly interesting. And we've had lots of lovely comments in the chat as well, which you wouldn't have been able to see while multitasking, talking and sharing your presentation. But lots of very engaged people. So thank you so much, Katy. Right, I will warn everyone in advance, my internet is a little bit sketchy. It started to go a little bit wobbly. So my lovely colleague Sue is on standby to take over should I freeze mid-strange face. So hopefully that won't happen. So we had a couple of questions on chat, which I will just address first so I don't lose them in the sort of Q&A session. Elizabeth asked, hopefully the lost year won't affect your funding for the project. That's a very good question.
Oh, yeah, that is a fantastic question. And luckily, I think I have a fantastic answer in that Heritage Lottery have been completely understanding and just get the whole situation. They have said, so it's up to us if we want to extend further. The funding is completely safe. We're constantly evaluating the situation with them. They at no point wanted to put anyone in dangerous situations. You know, if there's lockdown, you can't do it. It's health and safety was absolutely paramount to them. There has been no pressure on us. I can't really say anything more about it. They've been great. And if we need to, hopefully they'll be very on board with us extending the project.
That's fantastic news. It's just so vital and nerve-wracking. I remember when the news came in of the money coming in, and we were all literally whooping for joy. It's a very, very exciting project. She also asked a question of, which is a very good question again. How does SWT find that landowners and farmers respond to the hedgerow restoration support requests and the initiative? So I know you've been doing a lot of work on the ground, building up this army of landowners. So please do share what you've learned so far.
So far, it's been really, really positive because, you know, as you can see now, it's not hard to sell the hedgerow. They're pretty. No, we've got our 5 project partners who are all fantastic and again have just really risen to the occasion with the issues we've had with lockdown, because it's been a problem for everyone. It's not like this is just being felt by this project or the Surrey Wildlife Trust. It is global, and so we are, you know, there's never been a time where we're all in it together more, and everyone has been fantastic and looking at what we can do online. We've pushed back dates for things. You know, I had arranged this hedge laying and hedge planting program of events to begin in October, November time. Cancelled that because the second lockdown came in. We came out of lockdown, rearranged again with all the landowners, moved heaven and earth, it felt like, to try and put some dates in for the 22nd and even 23rd of December so that we could just say we'd done some stuff in 2020. Landowners being brilliant. Then we went into tier 4, cancelled that. And then we've been in lockdown ever since. And I just can't thank the partners in the project more. They've been fantastic, completely understanding, you know, giving me a jig up at times saying, no worries, you know, we'll see what we can do. We'll make it work. They're really on board, but then also looking at the wider project as well and how we're going to engage with new landowners. We're working with a lot of different people already. We've got a fantastic steering group and already getting new landowners that are interested in getting involved, and lots of links in how we get into those different groups as well. So it's all been overwhelmingly positive so far.
That's brilliant news. Absolutely brilliant. Right, the last question on the chat, and not the last question in total. We have 12 outstanding questions, Katy, in the Q&A feature. So they're coming in thick and fast. Which is better, a hedge growing completely as it likes or a laid hedge? That's a brilliant question.
It is. That is a fantastic question. And I have to say, I am not the absolute hedge laying guru. There is things about hedges that I do not know. But I would say overall, it's a laid hedge, or at the very least, a managed hedge. A hedge is so much more than just a row of planted trees. That's just a row of planted trees. That's not a hedgerow. You know, it is that diversity and that structure which comes from laying the hedge, which, you know, doesn't sound like a natural skill because it's not what hedgerows would have done, but they might have been grazed down and, you know, under pressures in different way from, let's just call it ancient fauna, you know, that's putting pressure on those plants and making them grow in different ways and interact in different ways. And plus, we don't have that diversity. We don't have all of that ancient fauna. We don't have that complexity of habitats anymore and those vast wild areas. So even though some people may say that hedge laying isn't a natural process, it is filling those niches and those gaps and providing ecosystem services to wildlife, those dispersal corridors. And a a row of trees won't provide it in the same way as a laid and managed hedge. Now, there are some species of trees that maybe aren't suitable for laying, but overall, I mean, I know some people that say there's nothing you can't lay. Which, is it okay to say that sort of thing? Have we reached like watershed? Sorry,
I understand you, Katy.
A hedge laying joke. Sorry, it's I haven't really talked to many people in a while, but yeah. So I would say overall, I would say a laid hedge, and certainly a managed hedge.
Brilliant. And that leads perfectly on to the next question from Christine. What does good hedgerow management mean?
Well, you'll just have to join us next week, Christina, for the whole presentation on management. But basically, management, I mean, it's hard to condense a whole webinar into the answer to one question, but management is making sure that that hedgerow remains really thick and dense. So you've got no gaps at the bottom, you've got a big shrubby layer at the top, and basically bigger and thicker and denser is better with hedgerows. And you don't get that just by leaving them. So even if you've got a hedgerow that you've laid, if you then leave it, you get a lot of leafy material at the top and in the middle, which stops any light getting down to the bottom. So the stuff generally at the bottom starts to die. And I felt that was kind of evident in some of those pictures where you could see there was still some bushiness at the top, but it becomes very gappy at the bottom with just one or two stems. And it's because a lot dies off due to lack of light and nutrients and other things getting to the base. Whereas if you keep trimming the top and not necessarily laying it again, but if you take everything, all the trees want to just grow, generally want to go straight up. So if you take off those top layers, it encourages it to remain bushy and put on new growth and bushier growth at the bottom as well, and keeps light and other things going through the bottom and getting out of control. So it's not a fantastic answer. It's a bit of a whirlwind answer, but
sign up to next week.
This is good. Yeah, join us next week.
Wonderful. Next question from Christine as well, actually, is, are there any plans to try and reintroduce the greater horseshoe bat? Oh, I'd love that to happen.
Oh, that would be lovely, wouldn't it? It would be fantastic. There are no plans at the moment from Surrey Wildlife Trust to reintroduce the greater horseshoe bat, but I think there is a lot of interest in this group that's in West Sussex, and I didn't mention it in the talk, but you know, that was talking about sort of a breeding population. We do get the odd one wandering through Surrey, so in theory, if that colony is doing quite well and the habitat is right, and you've got those dispersal mechanisms, aka well-managed hedgerows, then they should naturally want to disperse this way. So although we aren't proactively looking at doing a reintroduction, we are trying to make the habitat better for those species. So if you get those wanderers and those one that are coming in, if they find the habitat favourable, they're more likely to stay, and colonies will hopefully more naturally come back, because we don't know if they were there always, or if this is their recovery in the southeast and they might be dispersing more. They could be here already, we don't know. I haven't checked every cave and dark patch, every roosting tree. You know, they don't know about those West Sussex bats. They've only just been discovered, but they could have been there all along. There could be some in Surrey. It's not likely, but they could be in Surrey. So I think getting the habitat right is the first step, because even if we did want to reintroduction, if the habitat isn't right, then it won't work anyway, and it wouldn't be fair.
That alone makes me want to volunteer. Let's get it right for them. Wonderful creatures. All right, a wonderful question from Jennifer. I'm planning to build a dead hedge on my allotment and wondered if this was as good as a living hedge.
A really great question there. I'm actually a really big fan of a dead hedge because it's so simple, requires much less management, but can perform a lot of the same kind of ecosystem services and functions as a hedge. In short, is a dead hedge as good as a living hedge? It's maybe not. In some ways, the dead hedge will outperform a living hedge. You're going to have more dead wood in there and more like plant litter. And so you're going to have, you know, maybe more slugs and snails. It's going to be damper and wetter. So you're fulfilling those niches really, really well. But you're not going to have, obviously, that plant diversity, the same kind of structure. You won't obviously have the pollen and flowering plants or the berries. So as a corridor and as a protection and structure for wildlife to move, as a linear feature, which obviously a hedgerow is too, then it's fantastic. And a dead hedge is great at doing that. And if that's what you can have in your allotment, then yes, you know, a living hedge isn't right for everyone or in every space. And it's got to work for people and their spaces too. So I think if you're just trying to be able, if you're doing what you can and what you can have is a dead hedge, then I think that's fantastic. And maybe if bramble starts to grow over it and through it, you don't rip it all out and keep it. And then you've got some of that pollen and nectar and then fruit in the autumn, then all the better. And also that spiky protection, that's fantastic. But do I think a hedgerow, you know, that dead hedging is as good as hedgerows? Probably not, but dead hedges in their own right, also fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katy. Another good question. Why are we getting such a decline in hedgerow trees?
A very good question. Do you know, I don't know if I really know that one. I would say it's a general reduction in probably hedgerow quality in general and a lack of habitat. So probably as hedgerows are declining and the management of hedgerows, also those hedge trees are declining. You know, trees are big and they get in the way in agricultural spaces, in urban spaces, and even in wild spaces sometimes. So the answer for that one is I don't know conclusively, but I would say probably a loss of the hedgerow in general and the management is probably linked to it.
Brilliant. Right, sorry, just looking for the next questions. I'm trying to do too much at once. Multitasking is clearly not working for me tonight. In answer to your question, Christine, the hedgerow management presentation will be this time next week, I believe. So looking forward to that already. Just go to our online talks page to register. And lots of lovely comments coming in. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk, Katy. Good luck with your ongoing work. Is there any work to get farmers to stop trimming hedgerows so heavily? They are poor habitats. Oh, sorry, the questions are moving as I speak, so I clearly need to use my glasses, don't I? I'm worried about screen glare. I put them on this evening, and all I could see was this blaring light. So I don't want to blind you with this shine back from my glasses. Sorry about that. Right. So here the question is there any work to get farms to stop trimming hedgerows so heavily? They are poor habitats, or is this in the next presentation?
Well, I think it's really important that what we don't do is blame our farmers. They're obviously doing a fantastic job. They're trying to make a livelihood as well. And there isn't a lot of good information necessarily always really readily available to a lot of landowners. Maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, but I don't always think that we as a trust manage our hedgerows well enough. And, you know, time and resource is a big factor in that. I am now the Hedgerow Heritage Project Manager. Am I going to have the time to go around all of the trust hedgerows and manage them all well? No, I am focused in the North Downs and bringing that education on. So I would say the work we're doing is this education with land managers and local authorities and building that 63 kilometers worth of management plans. You know, that is all about educating and working with landowners in the North Downs to get their hedgerows into management plans. You know, that's not us enforcing anything on them. It is just raising awareness. You know, people the humble hedgerow is not appreciated enough. There, you know, we need more people to be a champion of hedgerows, and then also understand how to manage them well. I think that's the work that we're doing. We're getting the message out there, and we're working with people, and we're educating them. And then as a trust, we're also learning as we go as well. We are not the world authority in hedgerows. I'm working with some fantastic people, such as those from HedgeLink, the Surrey Hedge Lane group, the Southeast group. I'm going to be in trouble now if I don't mention some of them, but you know, I'm working with a lot of people who know their stuff with hedgerows far more than I do. So it's about us as a trust and me learning more as we go, and then imparting that knowledge on those partners and really just getting that message out there. That's the work we're doing.
Fascinating. And I can't right now imagine anyone that knows more than you about hedgerows, to be honest. I've been absolutely blown away by your knowledge this evening. Right, just a couple more questions, and more people saying they'd love to volunteer, which is fantastic.
Oh, excellent.
I have replied in text to one of the questions, but if you would like to volunteer, please complete the volunteering form on the website, I believe, which will go to Claire Courtier. It's just a sort of simple volunteer form, and then your generous proposition to help us will get forwarded to Katy.
Yeah,
and obviously when restrictions land, then we'll be up and running again.
I think when you're signing up to be a volunteer, you can tick what you're interested in volunteering in. And I think there's a Hedgerow Heritage option on there.
Perfect. And if you can't find it on the website, just email me at wt.org.uk or events@ same email address. We'll get your email and request to the right person. So coming to the last question, from Danielle, can the landowners get grants to work on their hedgerows? I have a landowner who has an estate of 200 acres in Surrey, and I'm interested in how SWT work with conservation grazing.
There's a lot of elements to that question. So yes, is the short answer. There is options for landowners and pots of money for them to plant hedgerows. From what I've learned from speaking to different landowners who were engaging with the project, there's quite often the pots of money for the plants to plant the hedgerows, but maybe not necessarily a protective fence to go around it if you've also got livestock grazing there. So we're looking at how to do that. You do have to look into the different funding methods, but they are out there, and actually they're quite abundant for getting the hedge plants and to plant a hedge, but it's all the other management that goes with it and the protection that you need, which is maybe a little bit harder. So we look, again, it's an education activity. You know, at the moment, there's a lot of emphasis obviously on the climate crisis and what we can do about it, and trees pop up. And then obviously a lot of conservation organizations are trying to get that message of the right tree in the right place. And hedgerows seem to be being picked up in that, but it's not just a case of planting a line of trees. There is more that goes with it. And in the future, I would like to see more, you know, being done and financially to support those that want to do it well, want to create that fantastic, you know, plethora of ecosystem services in a well-managed hedge. So pots of money out there, maybe not completely conclusive. And then there was something in there about the grazing as well. So
yes, I'm interested in how SWT work with conservation grazing.
So again, maybe that's one to have a chat about offline, but obviously we do have our grazing cattle at Surrey Wildlife Trust, our wonderful herd of belted Galloways, which do a lot of conservation grazing for us. So, but if you are interested in how you can get involved, or if you want to participate or have conservation grazing on your land, or how your animals can do that, I think it'd be worth contacting the trust independently. Just drop either info@ or me or you, Sophie, and the email can find its way to the right team.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katy. Right. I think we're coming to the last question. There was a lady that I think it was Janet mentioned that she was going to sort of try and plant a short hedgerow somewhere. So would the presentation next week be helpful for that?
Yep, we will be touching about planting, how to plant or have a hedge in your own garden as well. So yeah, if you're interested in that, come along to the next webinar.
Brilliant.
Edition of which neighbours will start doing DIY and how annoying will the dog be.
I loved hearing Amber just snuffling around, to be honest. I don't know if any of our members or volunteers present tonight have met Amber. She is the most beautiful dog and just completely adorable. So yeah, bring on the dog interruptions. Wonderful. I don't think I have any more questions, just lots of lovely comments and thank yous to you, Katy. People loved the supermarket and the shopping mall sort of analogies. That was just charming and just absolutely insightful. And thank you for talking at us for an hour with none of us smiling back at you. I'm pretty sure we were all smiling back at you, even though you couldn't see us.
Oh, that's so lovely. Well, thank you so much. Webinars are such a strange thing and now yet such a common part of our lives. So
they are. They're definitely here to stay. They're here to stay. So on that, I'm going to obviously thank Katy for that amazing presentation. To Sue for holding the fort and managing the questions so beautifully so I could read them out on the screen and volunteering to read them out when my internet was going down about a minute before you stopped talking. So I was very nervous, Katy. And thank you to all of you who have expressed interest in tonight's webinar. And if you're a volunteer or member, I know some of you have donated money tonight to come along. Thank you so much. It's such an exciting project and we're sort of desperate to continue that work. And obviously if you'd like to donate more, our website is always there. Just go to the donate button or you could volunteer. As Katy mentioned, we have another talk this time next week, which Katy will be talking about the management of hedgerows, which will be really exciting. And we have lots of other online talks and coffee mornings available for our members and volunteers. Next Wednesday, I believe it is the Sand Martin project, which is really exciting. Building giant sand castles for sand martins, as the press release reads. So join up and listen to more of that. Thank you so much for all your support. And we hope you have a lovely evening and stay engaged with nature at this trying time. It's certainly keeping lots of us sane. And as these talks are keeping lots of us sane as well. I speak for myself mainly, as you can see. All right, I'm going to wish you all good night. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.